I think there's many people who have the question as well, Edward, is who, if it's not a federal agency, who has ownership interests in the Federal Reserve? Can you answer that? Who owns the Federal Reserve?
It's a tricky question because the word own or ownership needs to be defined. Technically speaking, the Federal Reserve is owned by the member banks. Okay, that's just sort of a technicality which really doesn't mean much in the real world. They own the stock. They're given stock certificates. And so they're the owners of the stock. And in the real world of corporations, you would say, well, the people who own the stock own the company. Well, technically that's true. The banks own the Federal Reserve System. But what does ownership mean? If you cannot sell something, do you own it? Well, not really. See? And that's a different definition of the word ownership. The member banks cannot sell their stock. Mm-hmm. They do not have voting rights with that stock. They cannot, like if you were a stockholder, you could vote for your board of directors and so forth, and indirectly choose the president and that sort of thing. The member banks do not have that privilege. So what does this thing ownership mean? It's kind of it's a tricky word. It doesn't really mean what we normally think of when we say ownership. The fact of the matter is that the Federal Reserve System is controlled. Now there's the word we should be looking at. It's an association or a cartel, and it is controlled, like all cartels, by the big league players in the cartel, the ones with the most money, the ones with the most clout, the ones with the most political influence. Those are the controllers of the Federal Reserve System, and those are the biggest banks in New York.
Are they mainly U.S. banks, or are they also global banks?
They're mainly U.S. banks. Of course, it's a Federal Reserve System of the United States, so it's an American phenomenon. But we have to realize that these banks themselves are international or transnational in scope. And the leadership of these banks really don't think of themselves as Americans anymore. They think of themselves as internationalists. They're astride the globe. They have probably more employees outside of the United States than they do inside. So even though they're technically American banks and they're headquartered maybe in New York, they're really international in scope. And in the very beginning, the founders of the Federal Reserve System had very close business and economic ties with some of the largest banking consortia in Europe, such as the Rothschilds and the Warburgs. So from its very inception, the Federal Reserve System, although it had the face of the United States cartel, it had the heart and the soul of an international cartel.
Your book is prophetic in some ways, in many ways. You discuss the key word. In fact, you have an entire chapter on the topic that people have been hearing for the last several years, and that is bailouts. You discuss in your book how bailouts have been used effectively by the ruling elite to consolidate power over nations and to push forward the New World Order. In your opinion, Edward, are these same forces behind the recent financial bailouts that we've seen in the United States?
No question about it, Jerry. As a matter of fact, it's interesting you should bring that up because right now I'm sitting at my desk looking at a stack of papers. I'm just putting the finishing touches on a revision of that chapter. That's chapter 3 in the book, and dealing with actual case histories of bailouts. And it's necessary because we're going into the 28th printing of the book, and I decided it was time to do another edition, and this would be the 5th edition. And we needed to update this whole bailout history because what's happened since 2008 has been just explosive in terms of bailouts. And so it's very much on my mind at the moment. And the whole, just reviewing it from beginning to end in the early days when they were bailing out like Continental Illinois and the Philadelphia Bank and Unity Bank and New York City and Chrysler and Penn Central Railroad, that was the beginning of this process. But it was just like a little trickle. Even though it seemed huge, we're talking about millions and then billions of dollars. It was just going to be a trickle compared to when the floodgates finally opened in 2009 and 2008. Now we're talking about not just billions but trillions of dollars. And, what this actually means is that the government of the United States has gone into partnership with the Federal Reserve System. That's one of the essential characteristics of this creature, is that it's not just a banking cartel sitting over there in isolation by itself. It has taken the government in as a partner. It has literally purchased the politicians in Congress and in the Senate. They've have tremendous economic leverage, and politicians are afraid to do anything to upset the Fed because they know that if they did, they'd be grabbing hold of such a high voltage wire they'd probably be electrocuted right out of their office. So there's a partnership now. It's hard to distinguish where government stops and where the cartel begins. And we see people like Timothy Geithner. He moves into the Treasury, and then he was in the Federal Reserve, and then he was in banking. These bankers and Treasury officials sort of rotate around. They're all part of the same club. There's no fine distinction anymore between government and the Federal Reserve System and the banks. It's just sort of merged together. So this is what we're looking at when we're looking at the bailout process, because what happens is that the banks make bad business decisions. They make bad loans to third world countries or to large corporations or to cities and states, and they know in the beginning, right up front, that those loans are going to be shaky, but they don't care. They just think, well, the income stream is good for now. We'll get the interest on those loans for as long as we can. And when these corporations or third world countries can no longer afford to pay us our interest payments, we'll go to Congress and we'll get our buddies over there to bail them out, to send the money to these corporations or to these countries so they can renew the loans and continue sending the interest payment to the banks. It's a cute little round circle there, and it's just been going on for a long time. The bailout always is presented to the people as a means of helping the American people, of preserving the economy, of stabilizing the world. Heavens, we don't want a big company like that to go belly up. What would happen if Chrysler were to fold, or if General Motors were to fold? Well, look at the thousands of jobs that would be lost. Look at the domino effect it might have in the economy. What would happen if one of these large banks were allowed to fold? Oh, they're too big. We can't let them fold because that would be the first domino. Maybe another bank overseas would fold and we'd have an international crisis. What if the Soviets got involved and they went back and dropped an atomic bomb? Because, it goes on and on and on and on and on. There's always some argument that we must bail out these borrowers because if we don't, the world is going to come to an end, and the end result is that we do bail them out. It comes from the taxpayer in the form of taxes and inflation, mostly inflation, and it goes to these borrowers, these deadbeat borrowers, so that they can continue making interest payments to the bank. Now that's it. That's what the bailout scam is all about, is to keep the banks profitable even though they're making bad business decisions, bad loans, and in many cases they're engaged in fraudulent activities and paying themselves huge unearned bonuses and salaries and so forth. It's a gravy train of unbelievable proportions, and it goes on every day in Washington and through the Federal Reserve System.
It's absolutely astonishing and prophetic, and you've been saying this since 1994. We're going to have to go to a break. When we come back, I want to talk to you about what the final end game for the ruling elites is, what it might be, and also talk more about the early foundations of the nation and how we ended up in this huge mess we found ourselves in. So on the other side of this break, I'll continue my interview with author G. Edward Griffin. You're listening to Follow the Money Weekly on the web at ftmdaily.com. Don't go away. We'll be right back. Oh, welcome back to Follow the Money Weekly. I'm joined by author and documentary filmmaker G. Edward Griffin, who is sharing his insights about the Federal Reserve System and his popular book, The Creature from Jekyll Island. Welcome back, Edward. I want to ask you, we've been talking about the Federal Reserve System. We've been talking about how it's not federal, how it doesn't have any reserves, how it's a complete fraudulent system. But in your opinion, what is the final end game for the ruling elites? Where are they trying to take us?
I have to take a breath and pause for a moment because there are so many ways to look at that. I suppose the best way to answer that is not to get into too much detail, but to look at the broad strokes first, and then we can fill in the details later. I think that once people start down the path of acquiring great power. And I use the word power advisedly because that's what money is. The reason people want money is because it is power. Sometimes there's confusion on that. People say, I want money and power. Well, what they really want is power. If they could have power over other human beings without money, they would go for that too. But money is one of the most surefire methods or means of having power. So once people get the taste of power and the ability to command the services and loyalties and respect of other people using money, it's a heady wine. I've seen it happen at a very small scale, even among my acquaintances. Once they start down that path, it seems to be that an appetite is developed that requires more and more and more. And I have yet to see any, well, I guess I have, very few examples in history where people have had power that have rejected it or rejected the idea of more of it. I think it's necessary to mention the exception right here because that did certainly happen in the American experience. When our founding fathers won the Revolutionary War, they had complete power over the nation. And as you probably know, the American people really didn't object to a monarchy. Who would object to a monarchy? All governments were monarchies anyway. They all had their monarchs in control. And now what they didn't like is King George. They didn't like the way he was taxing them. But had it been some other monarch, they would have been perfectly happy with that. And now that the war was won, they wanted George Washington to be the new king of the American colonies formed in a union. Who's going to be the new king was the general question. Who is going to be the new aristocracy? So the American people at that time were not so well informed about the dangers of power. They just thought it was a question of who held it. So the men like Washington and Jefferson and Adams and so forth were just an incredible exception to the pages of history because they had the power. The people wanted to give them more of it, and they turned it down. They wrote a constitution that says, no, we do not want an aristocracy. We do not want titles. We do not want a king. We want a government with checks and balances so that no group can acquire more power over the others and than the people could handle and so forth. They were very concerned with rejecting power, but that was an exception in history. And we're looking at what's happening today. It's certainly that exception is hard to find today because the people who have power want more and more and more, and they're looking for ways every day to break the chains of the Constitution, to get rid of those checks and balances, and to concentrate all power into the hands of the king, which we still call the president, but we treat the office of presidency now as though it were a monarchy. The people write letters to the editor all the time and say, well, what is the president going to do about jobs? What is the president going to do about the economy? What's the president going to do about health care or employment and so forth? As though it's the president's job to do everything, you know? They want a king. Well, anyway, back to the main question is that once these people who have acquired an appetite for power through money, they just want more of it and more of it until finally it's total. And I think that's where the end game is we're heading into a system which they fondly call the New World Order. That's the name they have chosen to give it. But what it is it's not new at all. It's the old world order dressed up in new technology and new clothes, new verbiage. But it's the old system of a monarchy in which the ruling elite and the head of the system has absolute control, and you just have the peasants and the peons down at the bottom. That's where it's headed, I'm afraid to say, and I'm even more afraid to say that most of the people in America, at least, have no particular objection to it. They kind of think it's a good thing.
Yeah, they're basically asleep.
They're basically asleep. They have no view of history. They have no idea of our roots or the conflicts or the challenges, the failures, the frustrations. They have no idea of what happened before. To them, it's like a clean slate. And so the old saying is, if you don't know history, you're doomed to repeat its mistakes.